The wind howled off the Danube at dusk, pulling cold fog through the narrow streets of Vienna where, in the early winter of 2023, a storm was brewing not of nature, but of money, power, and ruin. Towering over the city's Baroque spires and modern glass facades was an empire built not on stability, but on borrowed dreams. Signa Holding, the property titan that had once seemed untouchable. Its founder, René Benko, had been a symbol of European financial ambition, a man who turned concrete and steel into billions, securing a place among the continent's wealthiest. But in the shadows of his success, a slow-moving catastrophe was gathering momentum, a financial earthquake that would shake faith in banking institutions across Europe. Benko was not born into privilege. He rose through grit and audacity, building Signa from a modest real estate venture into a sprawling network of assets that spanned continents. Skylines in Berlin, Rome, Munich, and even New York bore his mark. Tourists and locals alike admired buildings once stagnant and forgotten, now rejuvenated under Signa's banner. Investors saw brilliance. Governments courted him, and bankers, dazzled by the promise of high yields, lined up to lend. By 2022, Benko was worth billions. His empire seemed impervious. But beneath the looming facades, financial tapestries woven with complexity masked an unsettling truth. Something was terribly wrong. The trouble started quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in a dam no one noticed until the water had already begun to seep through. Signa's rapid expansion had been fueled by exceptionally cheap debt, credit that smelled of risk only in hindsight. When global interest rates were ultra-low, banks were eager to supply liquidity. Low rates made borrowing cheap, and Benko borrowed with abandon, acquiring everything from department stores to skyscrapers. Yet his empire's financial underpinnings were far from strong. Some loans lacked credible collateral. Others depended on optimistic bets about real estate markets that would soon turn. By November 2023, the inevitable had arrived. A confluence of rising interest rates, tightening credit markets, and misaligned investments triggered a crisis in liquidity. One by one, key subsidiaries of Signa began to default on debt obligations. The centerpiece of the empire, Signa Holding, reportedly carrying extraordinary debts exceeding 10 billion euros, collapsed into insolvency, a move that would send shockwaves through European credit markets. The juggernaut that had been the pride of Austrian enterprise was suddenly insolvent, its owners scrambling to contain the fallout. In the heart of Europe's financial districts, whispers grew louder. Institutions that had lent billions to Signa began tallying their exposure. Swiss private banks felt the shock, prompting risk reviews and ominous balance sheet revisions. Julius Baer, one of Switzerland's venerable lenders, found itself forced to reconsider its private credit business entirely after heavy losses connected to Signa exposures. This was no isolated default. It was a systemic tremor, reverberating through corridors of power from Zurich to Vienna and beyond. But what made this scandal more than a simple corporate bankruptcy was what investigators uncovered next. Authorities in Austria and neighboring jurisdictions began peeling back layers of financial transactions. What emerged was not just mismanagement, but a pattern of alleged deception. Asset transfers, circular funding tricks, and movements designed to mask the true state of Signa's finances and keep creditors in the dark. Prosecutors launched multi-front investigations into what they described as fraud, fictitious accounting practices, and concealment of assets. Benko, once celebrated in elite circles, was taken into custody in January 2025, his luxurious life upended as the wheels of justice began to turn. In courtrooms illuminated by cold fluorescent lights, the fall of a titan was laid bare. Prosecutors accused Benko of engaging in fraudulent conduct, moves that included diverting significant funds under the guise of legitimate payments, attempting to keep them beyond the reach of creditors, and funneling assets through opaque legal structures designed to obscure ownership. One contentious allegation centered on an advance payment of roughly €360,000 for a property lease that made little economic sense given Signa's dire situation, alongside €300,000 gifted to relatives at a critical moment of insolvency. The charges, under Austrian law, fall under fraudulent creda, a crime involving the diminishment of assets to the detriment of creditors. Outside the courtroom, Benko's world had shrunk. The sprawling offices that once echoed with voices of dealmakers were eerily quiet. Luxury watches and cash stashed away in private safes became evidence in yet another charge of concealment. His name, once synonymous with European real estate triumph, now trended on financial news feeds as symbols of ruin and betrayal. Yet the tale of Signa's downfall was not merely one of individual hubris. It exposed deeper fractures within Europe's financial ecosystem. Banks had lent recklessly, blinded by the allure of returns and prestige. Regulators struggled to keep pace with the financial engineering that masked risk. And investors, institutional and private alike, found their confidence shaken. The Signa collapse was the largest insolvency in Austria since World War II, with creditor claims running into the billions and assets sold off piecemeal to satisfy mounting demands. Amid the fallout, voices from across Europe called for reform. Analysts argued that the Signa story revealed systemic weaknesses, lax oversight of complex credit structures, inadequate stress tests for non-bank financial entities, and an over-reliance on optimistic asset valuations. In the halls of the European Central Bank and national financial authorities, policy debates ignited about how to prevent the next Signa, the next near collapse that could reverberate through markets and livelihoods. But even as regulators tightened rules and banks reevaluated their risk models, the human cost of the scandal became painfully clear. Pension funds that owned stakes in Signa's bonds saw their portfolios diminish. Small investors, confident in the stability of European finance, awoke to losses they had not anticipated. Workers whose jobs depended on companies within the Signa umbrella faced uncertainty. And for the citizens of Austria and beyond, the scandal became a cautionary tale that in the world of high finance, the line between genius and folly can be frighteningly thin. As investigators dug deeper, the picture that emerged was darker and more unsettling than a simple real estate bubble bursting. Signa was not one company, but a labyrinth. Hundreds of entities were layered across jurisdictions, stitched together through complex ownership chains that made it nearly impossible to see where money truly flowed. Loans moved from one subsidiary to another, assets were revalued internally, and fresh credit was often used not to build, but to plug holes left by earlier debts. To outsiders, it looked like growth. To insiders, it was survival, financed by time, optimism, and silence. European banks, long considered conservative compared to their American counterparts, found themselves exposed in ways few wanted to admit. The problem was not just how much they had lent, but how little they had questioned. Private banks extended credit based on Benko's reputation and the perceived safety of prime European real estate. After all, buildings in Vienna, Berlin, and Milan do not vanish overnight. But when rates rose and refinancing windows slammed shut, those assets could no longer be sold quickly without massive losses. What looked solid on paper became dangerously illiquid in reality. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings unfolded. Risk committees recalculated worst-case scenarios. Balance sheets were rewritten. In Switzerland, the shock forced banks to reconsider the entire private credit model that had boomed in the era of cheap money. In Austria, political pressure mounted as the public demanded to know how a single businessman had been allowed to accumulate so much leverage with so little transparency. The word systemic began to surface, not because Signa alone could destroy Europe, but because it revealed how fragile confidence had become. For René Benko, the unraveling was swift and merciless. Once photographed alongside politicians and CEOs, he now appeared in headlines stripped of titles, referred to simply as the suspect. Prosecutors described a man who had continued to live lavishly even as his empire suffocated under debt. Luxury watches, hidden cash, and carefully structured transfers painted a portrait not just of denial, but of desperation. The psychology was familiar to anyone who had studied financial collapses before. When the illusion starts to crack, the instinct is not to stop, but to double down. The climax came not with a dramatic market crash, but with a legal one. Arrests, indictments, and pretrial detentions marked the point of no return. Creditors lined up in court, armed with claims that dwarfed the remaining assets. Properties were carved up and auctioned, often at fractions of their former valuations. What once symbolized European ambition now stood as silent reminders of excess. Empty department stores, paused construction sites, and grand visions reduced to balance sheet footnotes. Yet the deeper consequence of the Signa collapse was not measured in euros alone. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. Investors became cautious. Banks tightened lending standards. Regulators accelerated reforms aimed at shadow credit structures and opaque ownership models. Across Europe, the question lingered. How many other empires have been built the same way, quietly hoping that tomorrow's money would always be enough to pay for yesterday's promises? In the end, the billionaire bank scam that almost broke Europe was not defined by a single villain or a single institution. It was a story about incentives, belief, and the dangerous comfort of success. As long as buildings rose and valuations climbed, no one wanted to look too closely at the foundations. And when those foundations finally gave way, the collapse reminded an entire continent of a brutal truth. Finance does not fail loudly at first. It fails slowly, invisibly, until suddenly it fails all at once. They promised fast growth and stable returns. But beneath the city, the truth was exposed. Growth built on debt only looks stable until the ground gives way.